Good morning and greetings in Jesus' name this morning. This morning you can turn in your Bibles to Judges 7, and we're going to read from that this morning for the sermon. The title of the sermon is Strength in Weakness, and I want to look at the life of Gideon, or this circumstance here, the defeat of the Midianites, and it's a fairly well-known story, but just reading over it again and pulling some lessons from it, I was challenged by the story again and thinking maybe it would be worthwhile to look at some more of these judges here. There's a lot of stories and lessons that can be taken from their lives, the judges, the various ones that are listed in the book of Judges, and some very interesting incidents that happened here. I think we'll start just by reading the first 8 verses of Judges 7 and sort of setting the scene here. Maybe just before this, we might remember within the life of Gideon, he had been called. He was threshing by the winepress when the angel came to him, and then he asked for, I think then shortly after that in chapter 6, he went and threw down some of the statues of Baal, and then God said that he was going to use him to overthrow and free the nation of Israel, and Gideon was always pretty hesitant to take the next step, and he asked God for a fleece and some other signs in that chapter. And now we're here in chapter 7, and we'll just read these first 8 verses here. Then Jerubbaal, who is Gideon, and all the people that were with him rose up early and pitched beside the well of Herod, so that the host of the Midianites were on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And the Lord said unto Gideon, the people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, mine own hand hath saved me. Now therefore go to, proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whosoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart early from Mount Gilead. And there returned of the people 22,000, and there remained 10,000. And the Lord said unto Gideon, the people that are yet too many, bring them down unto the water, and I will try them for thee there. And it shall be that of whom I say unto thee, this shall go with thee, the same shall go with thee, and of whomsoever I say unto thee, this shall not go with thee, the same shall not go. And he brought down the people unto the water, and the Lord said unto Gideon, every one that lappeth of the water with his tongue, as a dog lappeth him shalt thou set by himself. Likewise, every one that boweth down upon his knees to drink. And the people, and the number of them that lapped, putting their hands to their mouth, were 300 men. But all the rest of the people bowed down upon their knees to drink water. And the Lord said unto Gideon, by the 300 men that lapped will I save you, and deliver the Midianites into thine hand, and let all the other people go, every man unto his place. So the men took victuals or provisions in their hand and their trumpets, and he sent them all the rest of Israel, every man unto his tent, and retained those 300 men, and the host of Midian were beneath them in the valley. So we have a interesting scenario here, an interesting story. The way this army that was set against them was described, it describes them later as like a flock of locusts, and that they were innumerable in measure. And so there was this huge army set there against them. It says that they were, the host of Midian was beneath them in the valley, and they were in the hills up around here, up around the host of Midian, the army of Midianites. And they only had 32,000 people. So already, probably as military commanders, and Gideon was kind of the commander at this point, he probably was thinking, well, he doesn't know how they're going to be able to win this battle against these Midianites with only 32,000 men. So I'm sure when God spoke to him and said that there's too many people, he was probably pretty surprised to hear that that command. God said, there's too many people, so we need to trim some of them and get it down to a certain number that God had in mind here. And I think Gideon probably thought 32,000 already sounded like, not very many people. So Gideon gave the option that was described in Deuteronomy 20. That's talked about in Deuteronomy 20 verses like 1 through 8 there. It talks about how it says when you go out to war against your enemies and you see an army larger than your own, You shall not be afraid of them. And then it says that you should rely on the Lord your God. And then the officers shall speak to the people, saying, is there any man who has built a new house and has not dedicated it, or who has planted a vineyard and not enjoyed its fruit, or who has betrothed a wife and has not taken her? Let him go back to his house, lest he die in battle and another man take her. And the officers shall speak further to the people and say, is there any man who is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go back to his house, lest he make the heart of his fellows melt like his own. And so that's what Gideon was basically doing here. He was giving this option that was listed in Deuteronomy chapter 20, if you're going up against a force that's larger than your own. And so you can kind of imagine Gideon probably thinking, well, I'll tell this to the people. Hopefully not too many will leave here, but maybe, there's probably some that will leave. So I can imagine he said, well, I want to give you this opportunity. If you're fearful or if you're afraid, you do have the option to leave at this point. And 22,000 men left. And so it wasn't exactly a trickle. It was more like a mass exodus of people leaving. It'd be kind of like if 2/3 of the people here in the audience left, 1/3 of the people would feel like a pretty small amount that was left. And so 2/3 of the army just walked off and went back home. I guess they admitted that they were afraid of what was going to happen because they were so outnumbered already. And if you didn't trust in God, if the men here that were left didn't trust in God, this was probably pretty demoralizing to see all these people leaving the army, and they were probably all looking at each other and wondering, well, how are we, the 10,000 that are left, going to be able to fight these Midianites? And Gideon probably thought, well, that's done. That a lot of people left way more than I thought would leave, but God says, no, there's still too many people here. We need a lot less people than what we have, and I'm sure Gideon probably was thinking at this point, well, if he didn't trust God now, he was going to need to trust him because he must have some plan in mind here. So the next test drops the number from the water there, how they took the water, dropped the number from 10,000 to 300, which is a drop of 97%, and that's what's left, the 300 men to fight this enormous army of Midianites that's camped in the valley below them. And, that probably at this point, all the men that were left were probably thinking, well, God must have some plan in mind because there's no way that we can win this battle on our own. And I think that's exactly where God wanted them to be, that they realized that there was no human way that 300 people could defeat an army using weapons of war, the traditional weapons of war. And I think they realized that God must have had some bigger plan. There was no way they could win this. In U.S. military terminology, a battalion of soldiers is 300 to 1,000. And a field army is 50,000 to 70,000. And according to the numbers here, the Midianites had several field armies arrayed against this very small battalion of men. You can probably imagine sort of like a football team where one player is playing against a whole team. In other words, it was really outsized here. And there was no way that it was possible for them to win this battle on their own. God had them where he wanted them here to prove his power. And I don't know what the men that were remaining, the people that went back too, what they were thinking at this point. Probably they had questions about what God was doing at this point. And Gideon seemed to have questions here too. He didn't know what was happening. And often we get to those places in our life too where it feels like maybe everything goes against us or that the odds are really stacked against us, and we wonder what God is doing at those times. And I think that's where these men were at this time, is wondering how God was going to bring this about. Some people interpret the 300 remaining men as kind of a lesson about how if you get the right people around you, you can accomplish a lot. And that's true. It is good to have good people around you, but kind of the idea of the Marines, the few, the strong, however that slogan goes, that these were the Marines of the Israelite army, and so with only 300 of them, they were the good people that were going to be able to hold back this army. In history, that you might know the story about the 300 Spartans who held back the Persian army of about 70,000 in Thermopylae, there was a narrow path, and 300 Spartan soldiers were able to keep this enormous Persian army from crossing through there until they finally were overwhelmed by trickery as well. Somebody came around the back and said that there's a way that they can sneak troops around the back, and then they were defeated eventually. But kind of that idea that there's this elite group of people, that these 300 were like that, I don't think that's what this was. I don't know that these 300 were exceptional soldiers. All they needed to do was actually blow a trumpet and smash a jar. They didn't have to have hardly any military skills to do what God wanted them to do. So there was no reason they needed to be exceptionally good soldiers. And even when God selected the 300 that drank with their hands from the 9,700 who lapped at the water, I don't know that that was necessarily a judgment on the 9,700 that they did something wrong, but it was God's way of separating them. One message I was listening to, he said he can imagine them going back to home to their wife, and the wife saying, "Well, you're home early. What happened?" And they would have said, "Well, I don't know. I guess I drank wrong." And that eliminated me. I'm sure they probably were a little confused too, why one way of drinking was wrong and the other way wasn't. But the main point here was that the remaining 300 were the tokens so God could use his power. I don't think it was anything in and of themselves that made them exceptional. I don't know that they were the biggest and strongest of the soldiers. Maybe they were actually the weakest of the group. That could be for the lesson that God wanted to teach here. But I think they were probably all dedicated men who were willing to be used of God at this point. I think there's no doubt about that. God wasn't looking here for a certain type of men, but he was looking for a certain number of men. And that's where he got them to. This 300 were the remaining people that God needed to do this plan that he had. And at this point, the forces arrayed against them, it was clear that their only hope was going to be for something miraculous to happen, for them to be able to win this war. They were not going to win it by military power, and God wanted to show the children of Israel here that they could count on him to win their battles. And he had tried to show them this over and over throughout their history and their time, that he would fight their battles for them if they would let them. And this was just another example of that God was trying to show them. And it just seemed like they could never quite have the trust in God that he would actually fight for them. But again, if we are willing to trust and obey him, the same lesson applies to us today in 2025 as it did here thousands of years ago, that when men and women trust God to guide them, he directs them to outcomes they never would have achieved through their own strength. And I think that's one of the lessons that we see coming through here, that our own plans, our own strengths will never be able to succeed if we aren't allowing God to direct us. And God can use small things to bring about big results. Just the things that he gave, that he won the battle with here, were just everyday trumpets and jars that needed to be broken, but God had a plan for this. And what sort of people does God use to do his work in the world? You don't necessarily have to be the strongest or the bravest or the most gifted, but you do have to be committed. And that's, I think, what you see over and over that in the Bible, is that the men that were able to do powerful things with God were committed to him and had faith in him that he would direct them. And they had flaws, all of them had lots of flaws, but yet they had faith that God would be able to work through them, and he did. Think about Abraham, that many times in his life he failed, but yet his faith always was there, and God was able to start the nation of Israel through him. A great nation came from him. Think about Moses too, a man who was also afraid early in his life as well, and God used him to deliver the whole nation of Israel out of Egypt. You think about the 12 disciples, kind of a motley crew of men there from different walks of life, some that weren't very desirable, and from that the whole church that we have today came. You think about Paul too, also a man who was flawed as well, but yet talks about how he wasn't a real great speaker and that he had weaknesses, but God used him mightily too. And even thinking about the Anabaptists, also a very small group of people that started that movement, and it has continued on to this day and spread around the world. I think one of the lessons we can see here too is that God's grace can overcome our fear for us. We sometimes know we shouldn't live in fear, but yet it's a natural feeling that we have. And when the angel first came to Gideon back in chapter 6 here, the angel of the Lord, later on it just refers to him as the Lord. He was hiding from the Midianites, threshing there behind the winepress so that he was hidden from them. And the angel said, "The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor." And it almost seems like Gideon looked over his shoulder and said, well, there must be some other Gideon behind me because that's not me. I'm not a mighty man of valor. And he immediately objects to the angel and says, well, God isn't on our side anymore. He's basically, he doesn't do miracles anymore for us because he's abandoned us because of our sin. And the angel doesn't really let him off the hook. He spends more time explaining, and then Gideon goes in another round explaining why he's not qualified for this job. He said, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. And God continued to say, you're the one. You're the mighty man of valor that I want for this mission. And that's who God chose to give victory to the Israelites, even though he was of poor social standing, and he said even in the poor social standing, he was the least in that standing. Some other verses in the New Testament that stood out to me as I was thinking about this is how Paul talked about the Corinthians as well. And here he kind of talked about them, maybe, I don't know if you'd say put them in their place, but he said consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful, and not many were of noble birth. In other words, he was basically saying you weren't very smart, you weren't very powerful, and you weren't a very high class. And it's not just nicer if you can say that about yourself. I'm not sure how they felt about Paul saying that about them. But then that's in 1 Corinthians 1:25 through 29. It says, God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, and God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. That's from the ESV. And I think that's the lesson that we see in chapter 7 here about Gideon, is that's playing out here. And Paul said of himself in 2 Corinthians 12:9, he said, after he talked about the thorn in the flesh that God chose not to remove from them, and he said unto me, God said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And I think that's the spirit that we see coming through here, that God can work through even through our weakness, and sometimes much more than through when we think that we're strong. Then looking at the rest of the chapter, I don't think we're going to read, but basically looking at verses 9 through 22 here, what you see happening here is the plan unfolding, and it says there, it came to pass the same night in verse 9, that the Lord said unto him, arise, get down thee unto the host, for I have delivered it into thy hand. But if thou fear to go down, go thou with Purah thy servant down to the host. And so God was telling Gideon at this point, basically, I'm going to show you what's going to happen here. And it's interesting, too, that he said, but if thou fear to go down, here's a companion to go with you. God recognized that he might be afraid and gave him provision for that and said, here's a companion to go down with you at that, so you're not afraid as you go down into the host of the Midianites. So God understood and worked with his fear here and gave him companions and directed him to a place where he could understand what was going to happen here. And again, we might think that, we always need to be strong, and when God tells us to do something, we're just, God said it, that I believe it, and that settles it. But that's not what it seemed like Gideon was feeling here. God said, if you're afraid, and it seems like Gideon said, well, yes, I am afraid. I do want somebody with me. Because it says that he went with him, Purah went with him into the host, or into the camp. And God knows that. He knows about our anxieties, and that's why constantly the Bible talks about leaving our anxieties with him. He knows that we're frail. He remembers that we are dust. Psalms 103:14 And the verse before that says, as a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those that fear him. And I think that's how God sees us, as his children, and he wants to protect us, and he recognizes that we are human, that we're frail, and he works with us even in our weakness and our fear. And that's what you see coming through here in this story. So Gideon goes down to the camp. He snuck down to the camp at night, and God directed him to outside one of the tents where he heard soldiers talking about this dream. And the dream is pretty strange, about this roll of barley rolling, and I don't think we'll spend a lot of time to that, because the point is this: when he heard this dream and then he heard how they were interpreting him, he realized that this dream was basically sowing fear among the Midianites here. And I think that maybe this thing was going around the whole camp, that there was something going to happen that God, and I think they were probably fearful of the God of Israel, from what God had done for them before. Maybe there was just this feeling now going through the camp of the Midianites that something was going to happen, something bad, and this dream was kind of a way that was being validated. But God had this secret plan that he knew would defeat this much larger army by turning them against themselves, using their own might against themselves. And Gideon still didn't understand it here. And I think that's how the world often looks at God's people as well, as we're this weak little bunch of people that thinks crazy things like the Sermon on the Mount, things that never work in real life, and we practice that. And looking at this situation, we would have, by earthly wisdom, you would have said, how could some jars and trumpets possibly be of any use in a war? How can you fend off an army by blowing trumpets and smashing jars? But put in the right situation and used at the right time, those jars and trumpets had more effect than all the weapons in this battle that were present here among the Midianites. Made me think too about how psychological warfare, this is not something new, that war has often used elements of psychological warfare or sowing fear by tricking the enemy into thinking something was much larger than it was. Some of you may have heard about, in World War II, there was the Operation Fortitude, they call it, where the Allied British and American forces tricked the Germans into thinking that they were going to attack a different place than Normandy on D-Day, and so they blew up a whole bunch of tanks that were actually inflatable balloons that looked like tanks, fake aircraft, and misled radio transmissions that made the Germans think they were going to attack a different place than where they actually did. One time they also got supply trucks, and they would drive them in loops so that the Germans would think that there was a much larger buildup of troops and resources coming into this certain area, and they did that different times, or at least one time in the war as well, and made the Germans think that this was going to happen over here, when in fact they were planning for it to happen over here. And this is a little bit what was happening here. It was a form of psychological warfare. It didn't take many men to pull off this Operation Fortitude in World War II. They just needed enough people to make it work. But the Germans thought that this much, much larger army was going to be coming up against them, or else that they were putting all their efforts towards another place. But basically that had the same effect as Gideon's army here of 300. It didn't take many people to pull off this plan that God had. And when Gideon overheard the men discussing this dream here outside the tent, it seems like the pieces began to fit together for him. And he began to see that God does know what he's doing, and there is a plan here. And it says that after he heard this, he worshiped. And we don't know how he worshiped, but we know that he began to understand what God was doing, and it began to give him courage for the next step here that you see in the rest of this chapter. It also says that he returned to camp, and he was changed at this point. He returned to camp, and he suddenly had a clear message to the people, to the men that he was directing. He had a mission, and it seemed like he was a different person than the person you saw earlier on in this chapter, and also the man by the threshing by the winepress. Gideon said, "Arise, for the Lord has delivered into your hand the host of Midian." And he said, look on me and do likewise. And so he was willing to even say, now I'll use myself as an example. And I don't think this was because he was proud or anything like that he had somehow now become a proud person. But he had the strength and the courage that God had given him to say, look at me, look at what I have changed from what I was, and get strength from that as well. So the one here who was weak was now strong, and it was only because he saw God more clearly working and understood more what was happening, and his faith was strengthened here. And I think his men probably saw that change in him. I'm sure they did. And they were ready to go too. And they split into 3 groups, and then they went and broke their trumpets, or they blew their trumpets and broke the jars and shouted the sword of the Lord into Midian. And it says in 21, they stood every man in his place round about the camp, and all the host of Midian ran and cried and fled. And the 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host. And so the Midianites ended up basically killing each other because of their confusion and fear, and the battle was won here. There's a little bit more that goes with it. Then they pursued them and continued the war there. But thinking about strength and weakness, that sometimes the things that we think are the worst for us sometimes are the things that God needs to do in our lives to take us to where he wants us to. One example of that is Chuck Colson. I don't know if many of you have read his book, Loving God, where he talks about his life experiences. And he was sent to prison after the Watergate scandal and his part in that with Nixon. And he was known as Nixon's henchman, or the guy that got the dirty work done for Nixon. And because of that, he was sent to time in prison because of his role in that. And when he was there, he had a change of heart. He accepted Christ, and he said, when I get out of prison, I'm going to come back again. And he wanted to work with men who were in prison. And so he talked in his book here about being on the platform when he returned back to prison after he had been released, and he came back and he was going to speak to the men of this prison. He said, as I sat on the platform waiting my turn at the pulpit, my mind began to drift back in time to scholarships and honors earned, cases argued and won, great decisions made from lofty government offices. My life had been the perfect success story, the great American dream fulfilled. But all at once I realized it was not my success God had used to enable me to help those in prison, or in hundreds of others just like it. My life of success was not what had made this morning so glorious. All my achievements meant nothing in God's economy. No, the real legacy in my life was my biggest failure, that I was an ex-convict. My greatest humiliation, being sent to prison, was the beginning of God's greatest use of my life. He chose the one experience in which I could not glory for his glory. And I think that's just an interesting testimony that Colson had here. He was a Marine. He had a great law career, and his office was next to the President of the United States. So he had wound up about as high as you can go, and maybe President was the next highest, but he was getting there. And he talks, and I think his life is a great example of what Paul meant when he talks about boasting gladly in my weakness or in my infirmity. Often it is only in our weakness that the power of God can shine through us, and that's what Colson was talking about here, is this, what he thought was his greatest failure, being sent to prison, God used to be his greatest strength and help a lot of other people at the same time. Through failing, we are able to help others who fail, and through suffering and grief, we're able to help others in their time of grief. Through hardships, we grow stronger and learn the importance of relying on God. And all of those experiences are usually experiences where we feel our weakest and are most needy, but yet it's in those times that God can really use us and can help us to grow in him. The words of the hymn, Jesus, what a friend of sinners, it says, Jesus, what a strength and weakness, let me hide myself in him, tempted, tried, and sometimes failing, he, my strength, my victory wins. And I think that's a good, that song is really bringing across that message, that even though we are tempted and tried, and sometimes we fail, God, in his strength, by relying on him, he will win the victory. So just in closing here, when we are weak, God is that's the point where God can show himself strong. And Gideon's victory here shows that what God can do with believers who are committed to following him, even though they were weak and frail and fearful. When they saw the plan that God had, they became men of courage and were willing to fulfill that. It's not our strength, but our willingness to serve that lets God work through us. And so that's the challenge I'd like to leave for us this morning. And why don't we kneel for prayer at this time?